attendees. So I am happy to introduce Dr. Doug Fisher to our webinar this afternoon. Dr. Fisher is a professor of language and literacy education at the San Diego State University and a classroom teacher at the Health Sciences High and Middle College in San Diego. He is a recipient of the IRA Celebrate Literacy Award, the Farmer Award for Excellence in Writing from NCTE, and the Krista McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teacher Education. Dr. Fisher also is the author of numerous professional books on reading, differentiated instruction, and curriculum design. He is also the co-author of Sadlier's Vocabulary for Success program, helping middle school students close the vocabulary gap. Dr. Fisher, we are so happy to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary and the Common Core state standards. I hope you do ask questions and make this experience a little bit more interactive. I think one of the things that we need to be aware of are some of the big shifts, the conceptual shifts between most standards as we've experienced them for the last couple of decades and the Common Core state standards in the areas of English language arts. I think most people have been talking about there's a pretty significant increase in the expectations that students will be reading nonfiction or informational text. There are percentages recommended. There are some misunderstandings about that. That's across the students' day, not necessarily only in the English class. But we should be seeing kids reading a lot more nonfiction informational text. There's also a conceptual shift about content area literacy and developing students reading, writing, speaking, and listening, specifically in the areas of science, history, social studies, and technical subjects. A lot of people have worked on this for a long time, but it wasn't specifically called out in standards like it is now in the Common Core state standards. Among the more controversial aspects of the Common Core is the complexity of text students are expected to read, and really thinking through the role of hard text and how we teach kids to read increasingly complex text, and what does it mean to have a complex text. There's a whole bunch of work being done on quantitative and qualitative and text match factors to think about that complexity and how we can do a little better with that as Common Core is implemented. A fourth conceptual shift is focusing on the text-based questions, asking questions that require students to return to the text and provide evidence for their answer. There's a lot of examples of not doing that, letting kids take their personal experiences in and really not, and answer a bunch of questions that had nothing to do with the text. So we're really looking at a close reading of complex text and how students can go back to the text several times. Another conceptual shift is about argumentation in writing and the evidence that students use from a text. Some of the previews and discussions about how we're going to assess students under Common Core is that they will probably be presented with several pieces of text, maybe even different genres on a similar topic, and they will have to write in response to a prompt, drawing on evidence from multiple texts in their response, in their answer. And the last conceptual shift is really a different focus on academic vocabulary and an understanding of the role that vocabulary plays in learning all the other content areas. So those are 6 really big things I think that are different as we explore Common Core than most states have experienced in the past. We created Vocabulary for Success with these shifts in mind, as I hope you'll see. The Common Core state standards really are pushing that students are provided with rigorous content and applications of higher knowledge and higher order thinking skills, that we really are ratcheting up the difficulty level of school. There's been a number of conversations over the last decade about school becoming easier and teachers doing more of the work and really not transferring a lot of responsibility to students. And there's a recognition that school should be a struggle. It shouldn't be planned failure, but school should require, and the task we ask our students to do, should require some cognitive struggle. There's also an expectation around meeting college and career expectations, or what are the expectations for the world outside of the K-12 or pre-K-12 system to really build those skills for our students, to be prepared to succeed in that global economy and our world society. We have to think through the Common Core about what it means. What's our vision to be literate in the 21st century? What are the kinds of things students will do when they leave our school systems? The anchor standards are really the key to understanding how the Common Core works. So we're going to look at some of the anchor standards and then think about how they relate to vocabulary, specifically vocabulary instruction. There's a cluster around the complexity of text. And I'm not putting them in order 1 through 10. I'm putting them in order to help me think about the things we have to do. One of the major anchor standards is about students reading and comprehending texts, pretty hard texts, informational text and narrative text independently and proficiently. And I think the challenge in Common Core is going to be to remember Anchor Standard 10, this one, in all other things that we do. It's not sufficient to develop their understanding of narrative text if you're not also remembering that there's an anchor standard that students should be reading and understanding really complex pieces of text. There's also a cluster around key ideas and details that students are going to read closely. And close reading is not new. It fell out of favor for a while, but it's certainly not a new concept. It's a fairly old concept. The Common Core is requiring that we really think more carefully about close reading so students can really defend what a text says, make inferences from that, and provide evidence from the text to support their ideas and their conclusions. To identify those central themes and ideas and analyze the development of that idea across the text and then summarize it, and then how individuals, events, and ideas develop over the course of the text. This is hard to assess, and that's why those consortiums are around thinking about that. And as I look at these anchor standards, and you can look at 6th graders or 7th graders or 9th graders or 2nd graders for that matter, that's one of the great things about this is we have some consistency across what we're trying to accomplish. There's a lot of vocabulary demand in being able to do these things. To being able to read closely, you have to know what the author's trying to say. And background knowledge and vocabulary are critical to understanding what the author had to say. There's another cluster around the integration of knowledge and ideas to look at how content is presented in a variety of formats, to understand the ways arguments and claims are used, including what the author offered in terms of validity, relevance, and evidence. And then how I think we're going to see a lot of assessments being developed is to analyze multiple texts to think about ideas and evidence and background. In terms of craft and structure, here's where we really start paying attention to vocabulary. Interpret words and phrases in a text using technical, connotative, and figurative meanings, and how specific word choices shape the meaning and tone. Analyze the structure of text, how sentences work together in paragraphs, etc., and how the point of view and purpose shapes how we think about the text. And that's a big part of this, an assumption. We've elevated this idea of vocabulary to the level of anchor. It's not just a standard across the grade level. It's one of the core beliefs in the Common Core is that you got to know a lot of words, and there are ways to figure out those words. We have to have kids understand what the words mean, their denotation, as well as their connotation. So words have meanings, and they have a whole bunch of related ideas and shades of meanings, if you will. And one of the things we want to make sure we do in instruction with vocabulary is pay attention to what the words mean, as well as the ways in which the connotations of those words. There have been a couple of studies out about teaching only denotation. Students know the definition of words, maybe not that deep, but deep enough that they know the definitions, and they don't learn very well the connotations of words. So we need to keep building that experience for our students. Common Core also requires that literacy be embedded into science and social studies and history and technical subjects, which is fantastic. We've been trying to get this to happen since at least the 50s. There have been a lot of conversations about teachers and teachers of reading and really developing students' understanding of the ways in which reading, writing, speaking, and listening influence thinking. And now it's written right into the standards that we expect this to happen in these classes. One of the things we wanted to do in designing a new vocabulary program is to make sure that what students read is the appropriate concepts from science and history. So we're not looking at vocabulary with simply narrative passages, but we're looking at the opening, the introduction of the words through things that are appropriate from history and from science. So we are building that disciplinary literacy and that academic thinking in the disciplines. We also think about the anchor standards for language. This applies to specifically grade 6-12. And right in there it says, determine the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases by using context clues, word parts, and reference materials. And we've been writing about, Nancy and I have been writing about this for several years. When a reader comes to an unknown word, there are really only three things the reader can do. The reader can try to use some context clues. There are sometimes punctuation marks or embedded definitions or synonyms or antonyms or some kind of clue, context clue, which probably works about 50% of the time. That's the estimates that we keep reading about, people like Isabel Beck, etc. So it means half the time it's not going to work, but half the time it does work. You can also analyze the word parts, those prefixes and suffixes and roots and bases and cognates and word families, because that helps you think about what the word means. And if those two don't work for you, you have to go to reference materials. You look it up online, you look at a dictionary, you ask other people, whatever. This is a key skill, a habit that students have to develop. When we come to an unknown word, kids who are ready to go to college and have a job and be out there in the world of work, they know how to do this. They know how, first of all, they notice when when the word doesn't make sense to them. And they know what to do about it when the word doesn't make sense to them. In the past, we might have done a little bit of work on this. Context clues might have had, a 2-week or 5-week, kind of unit or whatever. Maybe we did word parts sprinkled through the language arts program. This is now a key anchor standard for college and career readiness in the area of language, is that students develop this habit, at least in 6th grade, starting if not a little bit before, but it's specifically called out in the 6th grade anchor standards that students know how to do this. We want to make sure that's practiced over and over and over again. It's a word-solving strategy. When you come to an unknown word, there are things you can do to figure out that word. And students need practice in developing that habit. It's not like we just tell them one time. They need a lot of practice in developing the habit of dealing with unknown words and unknown concepts. College and career readiness anchor standards in language also talk about thinking about figurative language and word relationships and the kind of this nuances and the variations and connotations of words' meanings, and how we can help students realize that it's not just always a literal word-by-word meaning, but sometimes there are phrases that change. You know the definition or the meaning of each word, but when you put it together as a phrase, it's more figurative. It doesn't make as much sense. So we really want to look at things like idioms and figurative language and how that works, and things like denotation and connotation, and what's the difference between what a word means, and is it a negative connotation or a positive connotation, or is it neutral? So we have to build, again, those habits with students over multiple weeks, years. The Common Core introduces a different language for vocabulary. We've heard a lot about Tier 1 words, Tier 2 words, Tier 3 words from Isabel Beck and her colleagues. And in the adolescent world, we hear a lot about general words, specialized words, and technical words. That's coming mainly out of VACA and BACA. The Common Core has a little different take on that. They're general academic words, and those are the words that have different meanings in different contexts. So a word like vessel means something in science and means something else in social studies. That's a general academic word. and then what we used to think of as the Tier 3 or technical words, according to Common Core, are called domain-specific words. And these are the words that pretty much hold their meaning, and they are specific to one area, science or biotechnical fields or whatever. So there's a lot of vocabulary development specifically called out in the language section of the Common Core standards. And again, students have to have a lot of practice with this general academic and the domain-specific words if they're going to be able to use them on the run. When we were thinking about vocabulary, we thought about what words we should teach and what words are worthy of being taught. Some of the words come from the basic word list. The word list that's been around for a really long time that says these are really key words that students have to know. So we looked at the basic word list and said, which words would challenge, from the basic word list, which words would challenge 6th and 7th and 8th graders? So we'll put some of those words in and develop their understanding of those basic words that are often those words that change their meaning in different contexts and different content. We also know that there's a whole bunch of words from background knowledge, that if you don't know these words, you're going to have a really hard time making sense of a text. Background knowledge is probably the greatest predictor of comprehension. Vocabulary is probably the second greatest predictor of comprehension of a given passage. So there are these background words that if you don't know, you really have a hard time. So we want to make sure we're developing students' understanding of those background knowledge word lists. And then finally, the academic word list, the high-frequency words that are used in college textbooks that are under-taught in most secondary school, middle school, and high school systems. So to build our vocabulary initiative, we drew from these three lists to create vocabulary for success. But telling students are telling them the words, what we call the assign, define, test method, doesn't really develop students' vocabulary. Simply assigning a set of words, telling students to define them, and then testing them on those words doesn't develop students' understanding of vocabulary. We need a much more systematic approach to vocabulary development if students are going to take ownership and really have responsibility for those words. So we started an instructional model back in 2001. We started working on this, Nancy and I, a long time ago. We modified the gradual release of responsibility that Pearson and colleagues developed, and we added some collaborative phase. We want students to work together, talking, interacting, and using academic language. That's, from our perspective, really, really important that students regularly interact, talk, using the target vocabulary so that they develop those words. So when I think about high-quality instruction, one of the things I'm looking for is that there's an I do it phase somewhere in the class period where the teacher does modeling, might model comprehension strategies or vocabulary word-solving strategies or general knowledge, but the teacher is doing the work. There's a purpose to the lesson. Here's what we're going to learn today. And the teacher gives a mental, cognitive example of that work. That doesn't have to occur in the beginning of a lesson. It has to occur somewhere in the lesson. I also think that a lesson should have guided instruction, that there's questioning and prompting and cueing so that we can understand students' error patterns and misconceptions and address them. There are misconceptions around vocabulary all the time. It's asking that question and providing that prompt and cue that allows us to clarify students' understanding. And as I already talked about, collaborative learning, we like to call it now productive group work. Students working together using academic language to produce things. And there's a reason for that. You can't learn words from just listening to words. And we have a ton of evidence on this, that students who spend most of their day listening to adults don't develop specific and complex vocabularies. They have general vocabularies because they have listening vocabulary. We need to have students saying all those words, using all those words in the presence of their peers, reading and writing and speaking all those words in addition to listening to them. And there should be independent work. Students should always have some task for which they are individually accountable for the learning. So we present these as two triangles side by side. There are parts of a lesson where the teacher is doing more of the work, and there are parts of the lesson where students are doing more work. There's an intentional move from teacher responsibility to student responsibility in each and every lesson. And understanding this, we had to think about in vocabulary instruction, how do we build that? So we look for things like teachers modeling, explaining, thinking through what words mean. That's focus, or I do it. That we look at a number of times, not just once, where we check for understanding, where we give quick assessments to get a sense of students' emerging knowledge of these vocabulary words so that we can prompt and cue or reteach as necessary. And then as part of vocabulary instruction, we include lots and lots of opportunities for students to use the words in the presence of their peers and independently on their own. That we can build vocabulary experiences for students using a gradual release of responsibility model. So that's what we did. We built a vocabulary initiative that has a teacher role, a student collaborative role, and a student independent role with multiple times to check for understanding so that students would have some experiences in developing their thinking. I did forget to say at the beginning about my website, which I'm going to put up. So if anybody, sorry, this is a review, remember all this? I did want to, it's fisherandfry.com. If you want more resources like some of our vocabulary work, or you want some of our modeling work, or some of our collaborative work, if you go to fisherandfry.com, there's a resource tab, and it's got tons of things we've written and PowerPoints and things like that in there. There's also a contact button if you want to contact me and ask me any more questions, if you feel more comfortable doing it on one-on-one rather than in this forum. I'm going to pause there and invite some questions. I'm going to open up the chat window, I think.
Oh, yeah, we have two questions.
Great.
How much time a day should we be teaching vocabulary instruction?
I think vocabulary occurs in a couple of different ways. I think the systematic instruction in vocabulary in a middle school English language arts class probably deserves 10 to 15 minutes a day. But that has to get added to the other kinds of instruction related to vocabulary that occur naturally. So when a student's doing writing and they don't use words that have been taught, you do a short lesson with them about rewriting based on some vocabulary. The same is true with history teachers or science teachers. They have to teach that vocabulary. They have to show that vocabulary and how they teach. To develop students' general academic vocabulary, the ones that we've been talking about through something like Vocabulary for Success, it's probably 10 or 15 minutes. But that's not the only vocabulary instruction students will have. They'll have some discipline-specific vocabulary in science and in history and in math and that kind of stuff.
Okay, that's great. We do have one hand raised, so I just want to remind people, if they do have a question, that the phones are muted, so they're going to have to type them into the question box or the chat box on their control panel. So if you could go ahead and type in your question, then we can have Doug answer it. Doug, we do have one more.
Okay.
How long should it take for one vocabulary lesson to be completed?
From Vocabulary for Success or in general?
Doesn't say, but
Okay.
let's do Vocabulary for Success.
So we wrote lessons that could be delivered in about 10 minutes of instruction. We also wrote hundreds of videos. So every single word that we want to teach has a short video with kids talking and interacting or backgrounds or whatever. And every passage that they read in which they encounter the words has a video. So that works for me to think about if I'm doing general academic vocabulary, that I can do that in about that amount of time. So that, I think that's the answer to the question. If it's a different question, type it in the chat window and I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay. Here's a question about reluctant readers and dyslexia. Two of the students are dyslexic, and the teacher is curious about how to get them to the point of the readiness issue The boys, one is a freshman in high school and the other is in college.
There's a fair amount of evidence on dyslexia about processing speed, that it seems like dyslexia is probably a general slowing down of the reading process. It's not specifically only one process. It's everything gets slowed down. Phonologically, lexicographically, comprehension, fluency, everything slows down. So there's a fair amount of evidence about how to speed up each of those processes so that you can approximate an average reader. I think the best evidence that I see out there is a intervention called RAVO, R-A-V-E dash or hyphen O, by Marianne Wolf at I think she's at Tufts. There's some evidence on that intervention really working for this, to raise that automaticity to kind of an average speed so that the student, the person can really read a lot faster and keep the meaning. So in a young adult with dyslexia, it's a lot around building automaticity for each of those literacy reading processes. You know, from the decoding process to the fluency process to the comprehension process to the lexical recognition process. There's a lot of work that has to be done to really build that. And the high school I work at, we have several students who have been identified with dyslexia, and that's what we've been using with them because of the evidence around it.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Doug. We have a question about English language learners and how vocabulary for success can help them.
I would say, you know, for a true beginner that is probably in a lot of a silent phase and you know, really doesn't have is not moving even to early intermediate, I think that's going to be harder. I think that's much more about listening and a lot of recognitions of the sound of language, etc. Once a student moves out of beginner to early intermediate, that's where this kind of vocabulary program is really going to help, because it's building those general words that lots of kids know, but they don't know all the meanings for. I was thinking about a student it was probably like 4 or 5 months ago now, who looked very confused in science when the teacher was talking about tissue. It happened to be an English learner. Very confused about the word tissue. And when asked by Kim, his biology teacher, he pointed to the Kleenex and said tissue. And that's a perfect example of common everyday words that we underteach when they have much more specific meanings. And that's what this does. You know, there's 69 definitions for the word run according to Webster's Dictionary. We have to make sure our students know a lot of definitions of the words, and that's what this is about. It's the connotation and denotation, and specifically those general academic words.
So just to piggyback on that, Doug, this program is for every student, not just English language learners.
Right. It's about academic language development. It's the background knowledge and vocabulary are the keys to comprehension.
Okay. We have a question about the difference between the vocabulary workshop program that Sadlier produces and this vocabulary for success program. And the difference really is that the vocabulary workshop is an independent program that should be used independently or for higher level students. So if you have any further questions about that, you can contact your rep to see the difference, to sample both programs. Are there any other questions? We just want to make sure we contact everybody, or we read your questions in the queue. I don't see any more. Okay. So Doug, I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful webinar and all the information that you've shared with us today. everyone on the phone, you will be getting an email from Sadlier, from us, and it will have a link to the recording. And if you have further questions, we'll take those questions and we'll forward them to Doug, and we'll start that communication. So again, Doug, thanks so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you all for joining, and visit the website and find out how to contact me. Thanks.